the first annual Horse Network Book Club. We have 3 amazing authors with us here today. This will be a monthly book club featuring some fantastic equestrian authors from all walks of life, all different types of writing. So we have 2 nonfiction authors and a fiction author. We also have people from all different places and books about different things. We have someone who focused on equine history, someone who wrote a book about equine therapy and horses in the prison system, and someone who wrote about hunter jumpers. And I'm so excited that they are all here, and I will introduce them as we go. So here's what today is going to look like. So first, each presenter is going to read or present their work. And then after that, we will be doing a discussion and talk about some horse stuff. So we're so glad to have you here. Thank you for starting. So up first is Ginger Gaffney. Ginger Gaffney is a top-ranked horse trainer. She received an MFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, and her work has been published in Tin House, The Unit Reader, Witness, Quarterly West, and other publications. She lives in Valerde, New Mexico, and this is her book. This is called Half Broke, and it is a memoir that talks about her experience working on a prison alternative ranch with members of that community and the horses there. So Ginger, take it away.
Hi everybody. Yeah, it's my book Half Broke, just out this year, February 2020. Norton published it. And let me tell you a little bit about it and a little bit about me. I've been a horse trainer for 25 years and still train horses every day. But about 7 years ago, or 2013, in the spring of 2013, I got a call from a ranch across the river. I live in New Mexico, and the book takes place all in New Mexico, though it was some journeys back to New Jersey and North Carolina. But anyhow, the ranch is right across the river from my house. And it's a resentencing ranch. It's called Delancey Street Foundation. You can look it up online. It's an amazing organization. Everybody there, 99% of them come from prison, and they have to interview from prison. They get to do 3 interviews. It's very hard to get in. But anyhow, this Delancey Street Foundation here in New Mexico is the only one with horses. It's a 17-acre ranch alongside the river. And they have, at the time, about 120 residents and their horses on this ranch. So it was pretty crowded, and there was a lot of trouble. People were getting hurt, horses were getting hurt. And when I got the call, they had told me that the horses were chasing them after breakfast, lunch, and dinner when they brought their trash out. And I said, what? No way. Horses they don't do that. And she's like, no, they're knocking us over. We're having to carry sticks, and we have to run to the container. And I was like, okay, I got to see this. If this is true, I have to see it. So part of me wanted to go there for that reason, just to see it, just to help the horses. I didn't know what I was getting into. I had no idea that I'd spend the next 7 years staying there and working there. And I never got paid. It was something that nobody actually gets paid on the ranch because it's completely run by the people on the ranch. It's peer run, as they say in the mental health world. So it's everybody who's in charge there is also somebody from prison. And 99% of them have issues with addiction, and that's how they ended up in prison with crimes related to drugs. So I wanted to read you a short, quick passage about the first time I was at the ranch. Hold on, let me get my glasses. Getting to be that point in my life where if I don't have these on, forget it. The shouting and screaming grows louder, and a few of the men run out to grab me, drag me back inside the hay barn. Marcus slams the gate behind us. We're all tucked into an 8-foot wide space in front of the hay. The horses roar up to the wooden gate at a gallop, a band of snaked bodies twisting and kicking dirt into the air. They level their heads and necks down to the height of their shoulders, flat and thin and ready to strike. But it sounds like a hiss, but it's more like spit. Hawk opens his mouth and his teeth jut forward at us. He snaps his jaw shut and curls back his lips. The force of it shoots a mist of saliva all over our faces. He can see us, they all can, but they cannot get to us. Their dark, hollow eyes are unrecognizable to me. Watching them bare their teeth at us like predators, as if we were their meal, makes me think these are not horses. So I had to get work with the horses pretty much by myself for about the first month. I didn't let anybody handle the horses except for me, because they were a whole band of dangerous horses. Somebody had broken an ankle by being stepped on. People had been kicked in the chest. Somebody had broken a wrist. And there was a horse on the ranch because they were trying to catch him. And there was 2 horses on the ranch that they had for 2 years and nobody could catch them. That means that they were chased around a lot by a lot of people. And that means they got really good at getting away. But I guess at one point, one of the residents, a team roper, who was in prison for a pretty big drug crime, he ended up trying to rope her one day in a stall. Her name was Luna, and he missed, but she reared and she smacked her head on the overhead beam and it broke her whole face down the middle. It'd been 6 weeks since that happened when I got the call, and the vet couldn't treat her. So it was really kind of up to me or somebody else, but I decided to take it on. Anyhow, I think what the book is really about, and Gretchen called it equine therapy. I'm not a therapist. I didn't know what I was getting into, but now I know in a bigger way than I've ever known, and I've always known it. Just the transformational power of the horses, especially for people at risk. And I think of everybody at the ranch as somebody at risk. They come from some pretty horrible backgrounds. They didn't just show up to be bad people. They came from some really big stories, which I share some in the book. So the book is really about my first year and a half of working with the residents and these horses that had really learned to attack. They were attacking people, and I had to, their whole instinct structure had changed to be a predator. And I had to work with them, and then I had to work with the people. And I ended up bringing some of my own horses and some of my horses in training for the first month. And I taught the residents what horses were really like. And they were so surprised and so happy to see that horses were loving creatures that really like the human relationship. And that's where we started. And so that's really what Half Broke's about. I don't know if I've used up all my time or not, but no, I can keep talking. Okay. So you're gonna meet some really amazing people, people who changed my life forever. Some of the people now are done with their prison term and are very good friends of mine. And people always ask me, do you see any of these people? And I say, yeah. And one woman, the woman in the book called Eliza, she's a very good friend. She's down in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and she really was so moved by the horses and what we did together for that. For with Eliza, I worked with her for 5 years. That she became a farrier, and so now she has her own professional business down in Albuquerque. She does all my horses. So yes, it was equine therapy, but I didn't know what I was getting into. It's pretty much a rough version of equine therapy.
Yeah.
But I think horse people really love it. There's so many horse scenes, and it was so important to me, and we'll probably get into this later, to represent horses exactly how I know them to be. And I rarely find that in literature. So it was a grand opportunity for me to write a horse book that I always wanted to read, a horse book that really depicted horses in the way that we experience them.
That's wonderful.
So
I love that.
Thanks.
So Ginger, you have so I have a question, a couple questions for you if you'd like.
Sure.
what has it been like for your book in particular? What has been the experience you've had with an equestrian related audience with your book? Right, because you're with Norton, so you're going to have a lot of different audiences, right?
Yeah.
What has that been like for having such an equestrian related audience?
Oh,
If that
really
makes sense.
great. Yeah, really great. Like I said, I think people are learning a ton about horses from my book, and I think I've engaged a whole bunch of people interested in horses now from the book. So the non-equestrians in all my Zoom interviews, and when I did actually have a month of being on a book tour, and then it all fell apart. So every time I'd go out, there was always some horse people in at my book signings, but a lot of non-horse people.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, most of the non-horse people ask me more questions about the people, and then the horse people always ask more questions about the horses. And then I did an interview last weekend, and it was a non-horse person. It was an hour long, and she asked all kinds of questions about horses, and I was so excited about that. So.
Oh, fantastic. Alrighty. We'll move on to our next author now. So up next, thank you so much, Ginger.
Thank you.
Up next is Susanna Forrest. Susanna Forrest is a British-born author who lives in Berlin. She writes nonfiction that fuses history, memoir, and reporting. Her books include Age of the Horse. It has the best gold cover. I bought my copy. I actually gave my first copy away and then bought my second copy at Powell's. So the first book is Age of the Horse, An Equine Journey Through Human History, and If Wishes Were Horses, a memoir of equine obsession. So Susanna, take it away.
Hi there. I've been so unusually efficient that I have a little PowerPoint to share. Yeah, I was someone who was crazy about horses, and then kind of growing up, ending up going to university, having a job in the city, got pretty distracted, I guess. And then someone suggested that I wrote a memoir about this sort of whole thing of being a pony mad little girl. And I started doing that, and then I found that actually the memoir turned into stuff about history and and from that I got really all the ideas for the Age of the Horse, where I looked at 6 ways we've used horses as wild animals, as sheer power, as horsepower, as status for war, as meat, and as a sort of cultural object in dressage and so on. And these have just been really rich books. They've taken me all over the world, to China and Mongolia, to France, Portugal, through all kinds of archives. It's just been really exciting to do. And at the moment, I'm working on a couple of projects, both of which came out of the previous book. One that's ongoing that's been a little bit interrupted by coronavirus, like everything. Women who were equestrian performers in the 19th century circus in Paris.
Oh, cool.
So I started with this woman in the middle, Salika Lazavsky, who unfortunately, after a huge amount of searching, I haven't been able to find out. I have all kinds of tempting facts that make a kind of constellation, but I can't quite locate her. The woman on the right was a stunt woman in the Hippodrome in Paris, Sarah L'Africain, and she was either from Africa or from America. It's very difficult to tell from the all the sort of hype that was built up around her. She's performing in the 1860s, and the woman on my left, maybe you're right, is the next essay, which will hopefully go up soon. She's called Jenny de Raden. She was from Germany originally, and she had, as well as being an excellent horsewoman, she had a very dramatic private life that I've been trying to get straight. But her most famous trick was to have the horse rear up, and then she would lean back from the side saddle, just sort of holding on with her knee and trail her hair down his tail, which usually worked, but was quite catastrophic when it didn't. But I'm fascinated by these women because sometimes there's a lot of information, sometimes there's next to no information, and I have to go hunting through all kinds of archives to find out about them. So I wanted to read something which is from The Age of the Horse, and it's about how we got this idea of wild horses as kind of romantic and noble creatures, because as far as I can tell, prior to like the early 19th century, wild horses were, you hunted them, you ate them, or they ate your crops. You know, they were mainly a problem, a pain in the backside. And something in the Romantic era really changed. And I think that comes from, there was a huge poem by Byron in 1819, which was based on a true story. But it was about a Polish nobleman in the 1600s who was fooling around with someone else's wife. And his punishment for that, he was strapped to the back, naked to the back of a wild horse. Actually, in the original, it's not wild, but Byron makes it wild. And this horse then gallops all the way back to Tartary, which is kind of the Ukraine, the steppe there. And then the horse sort of brings him to a whole herd of wild horses, you know, sort of a magnificent kingdom, and then drops down dead. And luckily Mazeppa is rescued and cut off his back. And this, under Byron, this poem was hugely popular, and a huge number of artists, musicians produced their own version and paintings. So I've got a few here, which will become clear as we go on. But I'm going to talk about, read a bit about one of the most popular incarnations. So I'll just have some water. Without a doubt, Mazeppa's most sensational incarnation was on the stage, where it became one of the most popular, widely performed pieces in the repertoire of the Hippodrama, a play in which the cast rode and performed with real horses. In January 1825, the Cirque Olympique in Paris opened with its version called Mazeppa ou le Cheval Tartare, and soon Astley's Amphitheatre in London followed with Henry Milner's Mazeppa, or the Wild Horse of Tartary, which souped up the action as far as theatrical machinery would allow. The horseman Andrew Ducrot was producer, and he added swooping equine dramatics to the more conservative French staging. In Ducrot's show, Byron's plot was tweaked vigorously into a melodrama complete with a foundling Mazeppa, a phantom horseman, Tartars disguised as gypsies, and the love interest, Alinska, nearly killing herself at her wedding altar. Tartary itself became an exotic oriental landscape of mystery, including, for unfathomable reasons, palm trees and occasional zebras, filled with horsemen tricked out in tinsel and Scythian-style spotted trousers. Tartary also developed a mountain landscape garnished with waterfalls and rickety bridges, which was constructed from platforms that could be raised and lowered with stage machinery. The actor John Cartledge was tied to the back of the wild horse and exited the stage to be replaced by another horse with a dummy strapped on board. This horse and dummy then careered up the helter-skelter mountain course, crisscrossing the stage, left to right and back again, all the way up to the flies, with offstage thunder, lightning and rattling hail, and the orchestra in full swing to drown out the hollow drumming of the galloping horse on the scenery. Cartledge and his original amount arrived in Tartary via a painted, rolling panorama of the Dnieper River at the beginning of Act 2, and at the climax of the wild ride, the horse crumbled to the boards dead, and a mechanical vulture swooped down to menace the hero with clacking beak. Wow. Cartledge would complete over 1,500 performances before retiring to run a saloon in Philadelphia. His wild horse not only had to be sure-footed, but to act the part of the savage animal convincingly. In 1878, Astley's were even claiming that they brought the wild horse direct from the Ukraine for added verisimilitude. American actress Clara Morris recalled one Homer in a New York production, Queen, which was later killed in an accident in another hippodrama when an inebriated actor steered her off a piece of scenery. This is a quote from Clara Morris. Came rearing, plunging, biting, snapping, whirling, kicking her way onto the stage. The scarlet lining of her dilating nostrils and the foam flying from her mouth made our screams very natural ones. She seemed to bite and tear at Mazeppa, and when set free, she stood straight up for one dreadful moment, in which she really endangered his life. Then, with a wild neigh, she tore up the runs as if fiends pursued her, with the man stretched helplessly on her inky back. Another illustration shows the moment one fiery, untamed steed caught stage fright and froze, with Mazeppa upside down on its back and two stagehands hauling the horse back under a rapidly descending curtain by the tail. One horse was so quiet that it had to be harried up the runs by barking dogs. Later, actors made the ride themselves, eschewing the dummy. One was killed in a performance at St. Louis. A year after the Astley's opening, Andrew Ducrot had his own amphitheatre on Great Charlotte, where he presented his own version of the wild Ukraine horse of Tartary, or the fate of Mazeppa. Ducrot also had a smash hit with his own equine tableau vivant, or pantomimes on horseback, including the ne plus ultra of equestrian art, The Wild Horse and the Savage, featuring the grey horse that was his finest actor. In the early 1860s, a New York entrepreneur called Captain John B. Smith had the happy notion of casting a woman called Ada Isaacs Menken, who you can see there in the center, in the leading role. A very young girl, thrown on her back, held by one foot only, her loosened hair dragging in the sand, and in this dangerous position, leaping with her galloping course, an arrangement of several barriers. The actress became such a success de scandale in her racy short tunic and flesh-colored tights that in a burlesque that mocked the production, it was claimed, the classical style of her dress does not much trouble the sewing machine. This racy update also ran and ran. The message was still cruder than Byron's hero strapped to his galloping desires, sexy girls on sexy horses in erotic oriental lands. So there she is in her prime, Ada Isaacs Menken, and another girl playing the role on just to one side.
That's fantastic.
It's kind of extraordinary. These were like a huge deal, and most major cities had these sort of equestrian melodramas, and they went on for decades, and they're just kind of completely forgotten now. It's
yeah, I guess the closest thing we have is like Cavalia or something like that. And it's not even.
Yeah. That's the nearest we have, but it's not quite as
dramatic,
insane as I think these were.
Wow. So this is an essay that you that essays that are coming out, or is this a part of your book that?
This is part of The Age of the Horse. This is the section on wild horses.
What I think is really interesting, Susanna, is how yours and Ginger's, both of your pieces kind of overlap with this sense of the horse as the horse has this moment of being the aggressor. Often don't see in modern modern romantic depictions of horses. And we could talk about we are seeing a little bit more of that with this current moment in history. But I'm wondering if you think this might be a super academic question, but like what you think of that change in the view of wildness and aggression in horses, and how you think it's changed for the modern era.
I think I don't know if aggression is always seen as part and parcel of horses. I mean, I saw a show by a French performer who I also wrote about in The Age of the Horse, and he was supposedly presenting this whole show was about the horses as wild creatures and presented naturally, but it was like the thing with the petri dish where the sort of insects that you're observing in the laboratory wouldn't normally attack each other, but if you stick them in a petri dish and turn a light on them, they will. And this show he was sort of recreating this sort of wild, authentic wildness, but it was basically doing things like shoving one horse into a group of horses it didn't know in a little stage with steep sides, or putting two stallions in to sort of play with each other and bite chunks of it out of each other, as it turned out. And I was pretty appalled by that show, and I wrote a critique about it later, but most of the audience loved it. Most of the reviews that I saw, especially in France, I think it's only been shown in France, thought it was the most amazing and profound thing. And I was sort of thinking, but this is all from this, this romantic and slightly pre-romantic idea of what wild animals do. And, in reality, wild horses, they just spend most of the time eating.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know, it would be great to like revisit all these sort of books like The Silver Brumby, where they have a particular idea of how wild horses behave, and sort of compare it to more up-to-date ethology and, this sort of very different ideas that we have of how horses behave now, because I think it usually tells us more about people than about horses, for sure.
Right. I think that's also, you can also argue even that with what Ginger's book was talking about too, right? Like we don't know what those horses would have been like without the people there, right? Ginger, would you say that's true?
Oh yeah, it was definitely a people issue.
Yeah, right. All right.
That was my one line summary for the book was people make many things out of horses, and horses just go on being horses. So it was,
right.
This is about the human constructions on it. But yeah.
Well, fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you for the PowerPoint too. It was fabulous.
Thank you.
Right?
I'll make it go in.
We're gonna geek out over it. All right, and up to our last but definitely not least reader of our events, and then we'll have some panel discussions afterwards. We have Anne Clermont. Am I saying your name right? Last name right?
It's Clermont.
Clermont, thank you. All right. The author of Learning to Fall, Anne Clermont, is both an unlikely novelist and an obvious one. Running a 75-horse equestrian center with her husband while raising 2 young daughters didn't leave much time for reading novels, let alone writing them. But there was something about living in the mountains of the San Francisco Bay Area and the magic of horses that has inspired her, not just then, but ever since her first trail ride at the age of 16. To write down her unique perspective on the world. And take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just fascinated by your books, Ginger and Susanna, so I can't wait to read them both. My background with horses is actually was non-existent. As I was growing up, I knew I wasn't raised around horses. I was raised in Krakow, Poland. It was as much in the city as possible. And if anything, actually, I was raised during the Solidarity movement. So the riots and the current situation that's going on actually brings home a lot of what I was growing up with, except it was people rising up against the government. And my mom was part of the Solidarity movement. So I actually grew up with times where every month, scheduled monthly, there was a riot that was rising up on the 13th of every month. And there was a curfew and tanks would roll right outside our windows. And we lived in an apartment building, in a small apartment. And my friend from down the hall, her name was the same as mine, in Polish, it's Anya, would come and she would stay in our apartment because her apartment was on the corner. And whenever the police and militia fired tear gas, they would go into her apartment, and she was nervous because her brother had actually gotten burned by one of the tear gas canisters. So my mom would actually lock us up in a small bathroom that had no windows, and she would put on a little tape recorder and we'd listen to stories. So for me, books have always been an escape. And writing books was a dream of mine, as were horses. Horses, I always looked through these picture books of horses and imagined myself being, you know, in the country, living in the country. And I think having been, you know, raised in the city and amongst all of that, I imagine living on a farm and being around horses. So when my parents moved to Canada when I was 9, and my life from there went on, and I went to university, but I married somebody who was a show jumper. And we moved to California. And even though I started off in biotech and I was doing cancer research, he and I started an equestrian facility where we boarded 75 horses and we ran a show jumping training program. While that was all fascinating and amazing, and I was around horses, I had no idea what it took to manage 75 horse stable and show jumping clients. It was all very overwhelming for me, and it was not the kind of life I imagined. It wasn't the peaceful, calm life of being on a ranch and being around horses and spending time with them. It was really just a people management, you know, mostly business, and very little time on the back of a horse. Although I did take dressage lessons and I did ride, but mostly it was about, you know, managing the facility and the program. So while I was there, I actually started writing a novel about the horses, which was a little bit of an escape for me from the business side of that, and being able to, you know, take my quiet times with the horses and then kind of live with it also in my alone time. So I made it actually a little bit of a secret. Nobody knew about it except my husband. And I started taking writing classes in San Francisco and the writer salon. It was my own little escape and getaway. So writing the novel was very much, again, an escape from the stressors of what ended up being a life that, even though it seemed, you know, like a dream, wasn't. And I think that my novel touches on that a lot, that like, what are our dreams and what are we pursuing, and how do we overcome the things that we are expected to be versus what our true desires are. So that's sort of where my novel started off with. And I didn't expect to be a writer. As I said, it was meant to be just as a little bit of an escape, but I ended up finding out that while I was writing, that's really what gives me a lot of joy and kind of fulfills who I am. But horses are still a huge part of my life. So even though we've left that business, because I realized that it wasn't the kind of business I wanted to run, I have pursued writing, and I hope to do that continually. And horses are still a part of our life, to the point where we've recently moved to Florida because our younger daughter still rides and competes. So I'll read just the beginning, couple of pages. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but sort of as an you know, just the beginning of the novel. So, and it's written in the first person point of view from Bryn, who is a young woman who's just been accepted to, or actually she's in the last year of vet school at UC Davis. So, as if conjuring my dream, the earth shook. My throat closed, and I knew I should run or duck or roll, any one of the things I'd been taught since elementary school to do during an earthquake. But I stood rooted, watching the horses gallop up from the creek that bordered the redwood forest, their hooves striking the cracked ground as they flew, their tails raised high. I wiped at the grit in my eyes with the heel of my hand. Then everything settled. The ground, the horses, the dust, the thunderous noise. And even though I'd been born and raised in earthquake country, and this was not unusual, typical even, from somewhere deep within me, like the tectonic plates colliding beneath the soles of my feet, something shifted, and two opposing forces clashed. Courage and fear, logic and absurdity, certainty and fantasy, tearing at me from the inside. I stood balancing on the tenuous ground, my helplessness startling me, and I had a sudden urge to taste and smell every bit of our patch of earth. I wanted to touch all the horses, run my hand along the white fence, and pick a few blades of grass just so the smell would linger on my fingers. Come on, Bryn, we don't have all day, Dad helped Jet, my jumper, by a leather lead shank. Pulling a cloth out, the one that always stayed tucked into the waist of his worn jeans. He wiped Jet's face, muttering under his breath, probably cussing out Derek, our groom, my longtime best friend, for missing a spot. I hurried over, my hand trembling as if the earth still shook. Did you feel it? Feel what? My pulse pounded in my ears. The earthquake. Must have been a small one. Dad stood back, narrowing his eyes as he assessed Jet, then wiped a speck of dust off Jet's chest. The restless herd snorted, their nostrils flaring, their hooves pawing at the dry ground, circling at the gate like they always do when they want to come in. They must have. They galloped all the way up from the valley. Dad glanced at the horses. Nothing we can do about that now. He wiped at the sweat trickling down the back of his neck into the crease of his dusty collar. Give me fog over this damned heat any day. I scanned the barn and house to make sure everything stood as it should. Should we worry about a larger one? No, it's probably nothing. Let's just get them loaded. I hesitated, but grabbed Jet's lead shank. The task of trailing horses made my stomach clench. It was my least favorite thing in the world. Large horses weren't meant to go into small boxes. But we'd owned Jet since he was a foal in utero, and he would be fine. He was always fine. I led Jet up the rubber-matted ramp into the 3-horse slanted load trailer. One of 4 more show seasons, Dad said. Yeah, I said, we were heading to one of the biggest competitions on the West Coast, the Queen Elizabeth II Cup at Spruce Meadows in Calgary. Dad stood behind me, ignoring the long whip that leaned against the trailer. Jet, having ridden in trailers hundreds of times, mostly traveling to shows for competitions, knew we were headed off to another, his tail up, nickering, excited to be loaded, as if to tell me his fearless spirit thirsted for victory. I'll just stop there, but
That's great.
So, that's the kind of beginning of the story, and it's a little bit of a coming of age novel, and as I said, it's really the bigger picture behind it is how do we combine the fears we have about doing what we really want, the expectations of others, and how do we deal with difficult situations and follow our dreams.
I remember the thing I remember when reading the novel, which I have a copy right here, is the relationship that the main character has with her parents, and now that your daughter is also competing, has that changed the way that you view equestrian parents? What is that like? What are your feelings?
That's a good question. You know, I think as many novelists, their first novels are always a little bit more biographical than their other ones. And not that this is biographical, because it is fiction. But you pull on things and fears I think you have with your own children and what your expectations are of them. And it's true. You know, I think, I also have a fear. I love horses, but because I didn't grow up around them, and I took my first trail ride, as I said, when I was 16 years old. I've had horses take off with me, and even though there's that fear, there's also like this amazing carefulness that you sense with the horses when they really know you and they trust you, and when you have that bond that they don't want to hurt you. So speaking to what Ginger and Susanna were talking about, and about how do we view the horses in that relationship, but yet they are unpredictable and they can be scary. So when you have your children on there, especially when they're young, you always worry, but then you also have to give them that ability to follow their dreams and do what they want to do, so that you're not putting your own expectations and your own dreams on them. And I think that's, with both of our daughters, our older one was the one that was really excited to ride when she was 3. Since she was 2 or 3, it was all horses. She never played with dolls. There were never any dolls, as much as like people give her Barbie dolls or baby dolls to carry. She never played with them. It was always horses. And then she's the one that started competing, but as time went on, she was more focused on school. As opposed to our younger one, she just wanted to do trail rides. She didn't want to compete. She was very happy just going out. We moved up to an island called Bainbridge Island. She would just ride through the trails in the forest for hours at a time. And I was always nervous, but my husband had done that growing up too. And he was like, this is the best thing we can do for her. And now she wants to compete, but is, she feels completely at one with horses because she's had so much time in the saddle. And so, you kind of do what you can as a parent, but, in the end, it's their passion and then their dreams that kind of drive that.
Mm-hmm. That was such a thoughtful answer to that question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. That was fantastic. All right, let us move on to the panel section. So this is going to be a little strange because right when you're usually in a panel, you would just pass the microphone to the next person. I'll give an order just based on where my screen is. So Susanna, you'll answer the question first. Ginger, you'll answer the question second. And you can answer the question third. If you want to pass and come back, you're more than welcome to. Whatever you feel comfortable with. If you're like, hey, I don't have a great answer for that question, that is also fine. So the first question that I had kind of feeds off of Anne's reading a little bit and the main horse in that book, which is Jet. And Jet is like the horse from heaven. Like that horse is so lovely. And so my first question is, who was the literary horse or the horse from a book that really inspired you and really loved you? So I'll give an example. The one that I always think about from writing is The Horse from the Far Pavilions by MMK. It's a horse named Dagobah, and Dagobah is a jerk, but he really loves like the main character of the book. And the word means trickster in the part of India that book takes place. And I always think about that horse. So Susanna's going first. Who's your horse, Susanna? Your literary horse.
My literary horse, actually, it's interesting talking about sort of wildness and noble wild horses. There was a brilliant series of novels I read growing up and went back and reread when I was working on my first book and found them every bit as profound and as good. And they're by a writer called Patricia Leach. And I mean, ostensibly they're, girl meets horse books. They're about, she rescues an Arab mare called Shanti from a circus. And it's unusual in pony books in that there's a slightly supernatural edge. And I think Patricia Leach was kind of a Buddhist as well. So it's not the usual kind of, girl meets pony, has difficulty, wins the rosette. It's about much bigger things, about, how you possess something or don't possess it, what hold you have over it, and also issues about creativity and writing. So I think it would have to be Shanti. I drew a lot of chestnut Arabs
Right,
when I was growing up because
covered with horse pictures.
Yes.
Right. Oh, nice, fantastic, yeah. Ginger, who is your literary horse?
So it's a hard question for me. I don't really have one, to be honest with you. So I'm not gonna pass. I'm gonna plug my horse Moo in my book. If I was to read this book and it wasn't written by me, Moo would be my favorite literary horse.
Love it.
And once you get to know him in the book, you'll see why. Because he just he's a real animal,
Mm-hmm.
and he shows up for everybody that needs him. And he's pretty complicated. He's tough. He's kind. He's sort of emblematic of all the trouble that surrounds us all. He kind of holds the center for everybody in the book. And so that's a great horse in a book, So I have to give you that as an answer.
That works. Yeah, Moo is a great horse. That horse does all the things in that book. Awesome. And who's your literary horse?
I loved Pilgrim from the Horse Whisperer. I don't know if I just love that story by Nicholas Evans. It was a horse. Well, that whole story really spoke to me. I read it before I was doing anything around horses. So for me, it was kind of like I said, that sort of world I wanted to live in out in Montana and the wilds, and yet it really was more of a personal story of this horse that had been injured and had a lot of issues, was broken, and the little girl was broken, and the family was broken. So it was a story more about bringing the family back together and keep the nature, healing the horse and the little girl that had both been injured together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think of like a horse, a horse in a book that has often informed the narrative of horses in books, it's definitely that one.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
I mean, you'd all probably argue that it would also be like Black Beauty and the Black from the Black Stallion, and some of the Mustang myths. But like that horse for the last, that book came out in the 90s, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Since that book came out, like how it's kind of influenced popular culture in this really funky way.
Yeah.
Good. Fabulous answers. The next question I have is, what is the biggest challenge about writing about horses?
The biggest challenge about writing about horses, one is that I just keep turning up fascinating new side stories and getting lost in those. And the other one was one I kind of tried to tackle at the end of The Age of the Horse, which is to stop projecting too much human stuff onto them, and to try and acknowledge, quite how different potentially they are, and to sort of untangle that. And I think a lot of horse history there's more now in academic horse history, but sort of giving the actual horses sort of not quite point of view, but what their experience sort of would have been. So it was that for me is the hardest thing, is to show, or at least hint at, what the actual reality is for horses, or what horses are like, without dropping into like the numerous sort of anthropomorphic issues, or for sure.
Yeah, so maintaining that the autonomy of that horse as carefully as possible.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Ginger, what's the most challenging thing about writing for horses for you?
Oh, I think Susanna's got it on top. That is definitely the hardest thing, is to let the horse stand on its own without us injecting all our human beliefs. It's just it's a problem in equine literature, and it makes our literature less literature, in my opinion, because we are doing some kind of fantasy version of the horse, and we don't need it, because horses are magical and amazing without it. So I just always checking myself on what I am putting in there, and I really for me, I guess the thing I work very hard on is to make the book, make the horse a character, and so that the story is not just the story of the humans at the ranch or this new work that I'm doing, but the horses actually have personality, and they all do, and they're all very individual, and just to be able to paint a picture with words, so that you don't drop in all your existing beliefs, your human beliefs, but try to paint a picture of movement, because horses' language and the way they are and everything that they have to say is through movement. So I spent a lot of time in movement, really describing movement as language in the book, so that horses become their own storytellers, that the reader can actually hear the story the horse is trying to tell, the character of each individual horse. So I think that's how I went about trying very hard not to do what Susanna's saying, is that the anthropomorphism is just to be able to make the horses there show, not tell, but show the horses telling, giving a story by that physical language that they carry.
Yeah, the use of body language, and I think all three of you did some of this in each of the sections that you were reading. There was often a lot more action and physical motion which happens within the prose itself, which you don't always see as much in other types of writing, right? If you're reading right? Like Hemingway couldn't write about horses very well because Hemingway writes in these little tiny like sentences that don't have a whole lot of action, right?
Yeah.
Not to say anything else about Hemingway except for that little style choice.
Right.
But yeah, I also think it's interesting, the idea of keeping us from making choices about those horses, but still keeping them characters, right? Which is also like really fits with, in Ginger's book, there's this section where she is really trying to maintain the, or really trying to help this young horse that this famous trainer has totally dismissed. And that trainer is committing the fallacy that we're talking about and just assigning meaning to that horse before the horse has a chance to give you its own meaning. Is that about right about that section, Ginger?
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah.
All right, Anne, what's the most challenging thing about writing about horses?
I agree about that. I think that, writing a story and trying to make the horses characters is definitely important. But for me, it's just down to the more technical writing. There's only so many times you can say they whinnied or nickered. And so it's really hard when it comes to how do you describe the noises that horses make, because you're trying to show, not tell. It becomes really hard when you're writing horse scenes. And so definitely a more technical thing.
Right? Yeah, the balance between the technical and the lyrical is a challenge, right? Because you don't want because there's always the purity police that are going to be like, oh, well, that saddle doesn't fit there on their withers, or whatever it is, right?
That's true. Actually, that's the other thing, is my book wasn't meant to be just for a horse audience. So trying to write a story especially about show jumping, so not that many people really know the sport, is how do you write about it without trying to explain every little piece of equipment and all of the nuances about it. So trying to make it more general and explain it by slipping things in and not going into a huge chunk of exposition, right? So that was definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
All right, it looks like we have time for one or two more. Let's see how we do. I really liked this one that someone sent. As people who spend a lot of time thinking about horses, or working with horses, what advice do you have to dealing with such uncertain times?
Oh. I mean, I think, I don't know, I remember when I was a child, I read a lot about horses, probably even more than I spent time with horses, because I didn't have my own horses. And I was always very proud to say, you never know everything about horses. There's always more to learn. There's always another book. And that's definitely been my experience. And I think really with central to that as well is the fact that you can't necessarily know horses, because they have, as we were just talking about, different existence, a different mindset in a lot of ways. And I guess from that, the thing is to keep learning and to be aware of others, to be careful of situations until you know more. I guess that sort of broadly applicable advice.
Yeah.
I think that's really good advice, the ability to know what you don't know, right? Or know that you know very little, even if you know a lot, right?
It's exactly that. A horse will always teach you that you do not know everything. So,
Right? Yeah, exactly. That's fantastic. Ginger, what advice do you have for uncertain times?
So most of the people on the ranch are brown people, mixed race people. I don't really get into that because, of course, because they're coming in from prison, right? With our over population of brown and black people in prison. But here in New Mexico, it's a mixed race, mostly Mexican, Hispanic, Native American. So what I know to be true, and why I will spend the rest of my life working with horses, is that it's really all about power. what we receive from the horse, because again, we go to them for something. They're not coming to us. So we go to them for something. So let's just be really clear about it. It's for power, a sense of real strength inside ourselves, and horses can give that to us in so many ways, and everybody needs it, especially now, that sense of power. So horses give it to us in a way that you can't get it any other way, to be able to be on the back or even beside a horse, and how that interchange happens. I see it every day of my life. I see it in almost every lesson I give. I see horses giving us a sense of our own power. And that is really what we need right now, because we need our power and we need to know it. Mm-hmm. And I know horses are giving it to us every day, gratefully. Yeah.
I think that's really useful too. And also with power with horses too, there's also this level of consent and understanding and teamwork, right? Like you can't get power with a horse unless you've earned it, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost this power based on communication and equity that could be super useful right now. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what advice do you have for uncertain times?
Well, when I was 17 years old, one of my first jobs was actually working as a working student for a dressage trainer in Canada, and it was a whole summer, so it was 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. You go in, and I think the best thing right now is, especially if you're a horse person, is focusing on every day. It's going in, you get up, you feed, you clean the stall, you ride, you focus on that moment. Don't look too far to the past, don't look too much into the future, and get off social media and be there. I think nature and presence with those around us, those we love, especially animals, have a lot to teach us on how we can behave and what works and what doesn't, because that unsettledness and the fear and anxiety is not good, and the horses are a mirror image of that. And so the more calm you are, the more present you are, I think the better you feel, and it shows to other people, and it kind of spreads.
Mm-hmm. So using the mindfulness practices we learned in the barn out in the rest of the world.
Exactly. Exactly. And learning from the horses, learning that our behavior, if they can sense it, other people can too. We just don't realize it. Mm-hmm. So really keeping that calmness, I think, will help others as well.
All right. Looks like we have time for just one last question. If you had to write about something besides horses, what would you write about?
Well, I actually, the next book that I'm working on, it comes from the age of the horse, but it's about archaeology. So that's what I'm moving on to now, and it's completely fascinating and ridiculously complicated. Yeah, I'm having a lot of fun. So archaeology.
Nice. I'm writing right now about, always gonna have horses because that's what I know the most. But I'm writing a lot about recovery, and what recovery really, really, really is. And I've got it's a novel in progress, and 6 women characters, and it's basically a book about gender and gender fluidity and power, and the process of recovery for women in particular. And so I'm really, really interested in that, the way our culture really doesn't fully embrace what recovery really is, and all the things that we're doing to so-called work with the drug addiction problem are absolutely pathetic. And so this is 6 women who are going to take us into that journey in their lives. Yeah. So.
Yeah, our fundamental understanding as a culture of recovery is very limited, and not usually very well spoken of. And I think it's also a trouble in the horse world, right? Often we use the phrase that, oh, if you have a horse, it'll fix everything, right? And it's not that simple. But yeah, I think those both sound great. Anne, which book, what would you write about if you weren't writing about horses?
Well, right now I'm actually working a novel that's not about horses, and it is a challenge because horses aren't what I know as well, but it's set in Switzerland, and it's for people that get together after they had grown up spending summers in this house on this lake, and they come together 20 years later, and there was a mystery that happened that they, then, comes and reveals itself in the present, and they're all dealing with their own issues, career issues, and careers are all on hold. So it's sort of the bigger theme of it is, what does it take to create art, and where do we need to get to be there to be creative?
Fantastic. That is completely different than horses, right? Having a very character-driven, like a literary-based novel. That's fantastic. These are fantastic answers. Thank you guys so much for coming and being part of the first Horse Network book club.
Thank you.
You can find the books on EquiShopper and things like that. Thank you all for watching as well. We'll see you soon. And then I'm going to move this. Anything I missed, guys? Anything you'd like me to make sure that I include? Thank you guys so much for being here. It is such a pleasure. I've been fangirling for weeks.
Thank you for having us. I'm so excited.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And it was lovely to meet you all a long distance from Berlin.
Right.
And I think, Gretchen, I want somehow in these series to at least you get acknowledged as a writer. Somehow maybe Carly can introduce you and talk about some of the things you've worked on and some of the things you've published. So I want you to be built up a little bit more in these series, if I can say.
Well, that's nice of you. Yeah, that is
Yeah, I mean, I think you need an introduction. I mean, you've done some amazing things, so
yeah.
really, I'm not,
Okay, yeah.
So I think Carly somehow, if this is going to be recorded, I don't know, but you as the host of this, you need to really shine, and so we need to know more about you.
Oh, okay. I can definitely do that. That is the advice I can use, right?
That's a great suggestion, Ginger. We're always happy to wax poetic about Gretchen. She does some of the most important work on our site, for sure.
Alrighty. Well, it's 1 o'clock.
Good.
I will
Okay.
let you all.
I have to go and participate in a Zoom murder mystery. So where I am the New York showgirl who may or may not be the murderer. So
Sounds awesome.
I have to go and get my costume on now.
Oh, why did you wear the costume for the reading?
I know. I thought, can I get something that's kind of suitable for both? Maybe no. I don't.
We're going to talk about horses.
Well, the showgirl could have worked. I mean, some of the pictures you showed, those girls.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you.
That's
Thank
really
you
fun.
all.
Thank you,
Lovely to
Gretchen.
meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you all.
Bye bye.
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 Bye.